My father once told a judge that I was nothing more than a girl who carries trays for a living. He sat in that courtroom, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and looked at me as if I were a smudge on his polished shoes. He thought my apron defined my worth. He didn't realize that while I was serving coffee, I was also measuring the exact depth of his grave. The smell of stale grease and cheap lavender soap is something you never really get out of your skin when you work doubles at a roadside diner. To my father, that smell was the scent of failure. To me, it was the scent of survival. My name is Lily Rose. For most of my life, I lived in the shadow of a man who measured people by the commas in their bank accounts. My father, Julian Rose, was a man of prestige, a high-powered corporate litigator who treated his family like a deposition, something to be managed, controlled, and occasionally suppressed. When I told him I wanted to study forensic accounting instead of joining his law firm, he didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply cut me off. No tuition, no rent, no safety net. He told me that without the Rose name to back me up, I'd be lucky to end up serving fries to people who actually mattered. So I did exactly that. I took a job at the Silver Kettle, a 24-hour diner 3 towns away from his penthouse. I traded my designer dresses for a polyester uniform and a name tag that just said, Lily. For 3 years, I lived in a studio apartment where the heater rattled like a dying breath. I went to school during the day and worked the graveyard shift. I learned things at that diner that no law school could ever teach. I learned how to read people. I learned how to spot a lie by the way a man grips his coffee mug, and most importantly, I learned how to be invisible. People talk to waitresses like they're part of the furniture. They discuss business deals, affairs, and secrets over scrambled eggs, thinking the girl refilling their water isn't listening. But I was always listening, and I was always taking notes. The turning point came on a Tuesday. The diner was nearly empty, save for a man in a rumpled suit sitting in the corner booth. He looked terrified. I recognized him immediately. He was the junior partner at my father's firm. He had a thick manila folder spread out on the table, and he was shaking so hard he spilled his black coffee all over the documents. As I rushed over with a cloth to help him clean up, my eyes caught a glimpse of the letterhead. It was a private offshore ledger, my father's personal account. Don't worry, I said softly, my voice as calm as a summer lake. I've seen worse messes than this. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't recognize me as the girl from the holiday parties 5 years ago. To him, I was just a waitress. You have no idea, he whispered, staring at the soaked papers. This is the kind of mess that ends lives. I smiled, a small, cold flick of my lips. Then it's a good thing I'm an expert at cleaning up. That was the night I stopped being the daughter who ran away. That was the night I became the person who would bring Julian Rose to his knees. I didn't need his money, and I didn't need his permission. I just needed that folder. The folder was damp with coffee, but the ink was still legible enough to change my life and ruin my father's. As I wiped the table with practiced rhythmic circles, I committed every number, every account code, and every offshore bank name to memory. I had spent 3 years studying forensic patterns. I didn't need to steal the papers. I just needed to understand the rhythm of the fraud. Rough night? I asked, keeping my voice light and honey-sweet, the perfect persona of a girl who didn't know the difference between a tax bracket and a taxi cab. The junior partner, a man named Miller, let out a jagged laugh. You could say that. Just stay in school, kid. Don't ever get into high-stakes law. It's a shark tank, where the sharks eat their own children. If only you knew, I thought, as I moved to the next table. For the next week, I didn't sleep. After my shifts ended at 4 a.m, I sat in my tiny kitchen, the fluorescent light flickering overhead, and reconstructed my father's secret empire on a cheap laptop. It was a masterpiece of deception. He wasn't just hiding money from the government. He was skimming from his own clients, the very people who trusted him to protect their fortunes. The irony was delicious. He called me just a waitress, yet it was the tips I'd saved from that lowly job that paid for the encrypted software I was now using to dismantle his life. I knew I couldn't just go to the police. My father owned half the precinct and played golf with the district attorney. To beat a man who built his throne on the law, I had to wait for him to step into an arena where his charisma couldn't save him. That opportunity arrived 2 months later, in the form of a legal summons. My father was being sued for mismanagement of funds by a former business associate. It was a civil case, a nuisance to him, something he expected to swish away with a few backroom handshakes. He had no idea that I had spent the last 60 days feeding anonymous tips to the plaintiff's legal team, guiding them like a ghost through the labyrinth of his lies. The morning of the hearing, I didn't wear my uniform. I put on a sharp charcoal gray suit I'd bought from a thrift store, and spent an hour pinning my hair back until I looked like the ghost of the daughter he'd discarded. I walked into the courtroom 5 minutes late. The heavy oak doors creaked, and every head turned. My father was sitting at the defense table, looking radiant and untouchable. When his eyes met mine, his expression didn't soften. He didn't look happy to see his only child. He looked annoyed, as if a stray dog had wandered into his garden. He leaned over to his lead counsel and whispered something loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "Don't mind her. That's just my daughter. She spent the last few years as a waitress. I imagine she's just here to ask for an advance on her inheritance." The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, looked at me with a mix of pity and impatience. "Miss Rose," the judge said, "do you have a reason for being here? This is a closed evidentiary hearing." I walked toward the witness stand, my heels clicking like a countdown. "I'm not here for money, Your Honor. I'm here as a rebuttal witness for the plaintiff. I have documentation regarding the disappeared escrow accounts from the 2024 fiscal year." My father stood up, his face reddening. "This is a joke. Your Honor, my daughter has no legal standing or financial expertise. She clears tables at a diner. She's likely confused a grocery list for a bank statement." I didn't look at him. I looked at the judge. "I am a certified forensic technician with a specialization in shell company deconstruction. And while my father is right, I am a waitress. It turns out that when you're just a waitress, people forget you have ears. And when you're his daughter, you have the keys to his basement archives." I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and held it up. The room went silent. I could see the sweat beginning to bead on my father's upper lip. The predator had finally realized he was standing in a trap. The judge stared at the small silver flash drive in my hand for a long, heavy moment. My father's lawyer scrambled to his feet, shouting about unauthorized evidence and breach of privacy, but I kept my gaze fixed on the bench. I wasn't the scared girl who had left his house in tears 3 years ago. I was a professional, and I had the math to prove it. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the noise like a cold blade. "The defense claims I am just a waitress. If that is true, then they should have no fear of what a simple waitress has found. Unless, of course, they are admitting that a girl with an apron can see through a multi-million-dollar fraud better than their entire legal team." The judge leaned back, a faint, sharp glint of interest appearing in her eyes. "I'll allow a preliminary review of the digital files in chambers. Mr. Rose, if your daughter truly has nothing but grocery lists, this will be over in 10 minutes. We moved to the judge's private office. My father walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine. "You're burning your life down, Lily," he hissed, his voice a low vibration of pure venom. "You'll never work in this town again. You'll be lucky if you're still serving coffee when I'm through with you." I didn't blink. "I'm not looking for a job, Dad. I'm looking for the truth." Inside the chambers, I plugged the drive into the court's laptop. I didn't show them photos or emails. I showed them the shadow ledger. I'd spent months cross-referencing the tips I made at the diner with the wire transfers in his private accounts. I showed how he used a fake catering company, ironically named Rose Petal Events, to wash money he'd stolen from a local children's hospital endowment fund. The room went deathly quiet. Even my father's own lawyer stepped back from him, his hands raised as if to distance himself from a crime scene. "This," the judge whispered, scrolling through the spreadsheets. "These are encrypted internal bank communications. How did you get these, Miss Rose?" "I didn't hack them," I replied calmly. "My father kept his old server in the basement of our family home. When he kicked me out, he forgot that I was the one who set up his home network when I was 16. He never changed the admin password. He thought I was too simple to care about technology. My father's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. The mask of the sophisticated, untouchable litigator was cracking, revealing the panicked animal underneath. He realized then that I hadn't just been surviving at that diner. I had been haunting him from the shadows of his own house. "It's all fabricated," he barked, his voice cracking. "She's a disgruntled child. She's doing this for revenge because I didn't pay for her lifestyle." I turned to him then, the first time I had looked him in the eye all day. "I paid for my own lifestyle, Julian, every cent of it. I worked the shifts nobody wanted, so I could afford the education you said I wasn't smart enough for. You called me a waitress like it was a slur, but being a waitress taught me how to watch. And I've been watching you fail for a long time." The judge looked up from the screen, her expression hardening. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Get the district attorney's office on the line, and tell the bailiff to secure the exits. We are no longer looking at a civil dispute. This is a criminal seizure." My father slumped into a leather chair, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss. For the first time in my life, he looked small. But this was only the beginning. Hitting his bank account was one thing, dismantling the web of people who helped him was another. And I knew exactly who was waiting in the lobby to testify next. The silence in the judge's chambers was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. My father's eyes darted toward the door, his fingers twitching against his knees. He was used to being the smartest man in the room, the one who pulled the strings, but the strings were wrapping around his own neck now. "Who else did you bring, Lily?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and genuine fear. "I didn't have to bring anyone, Dad," I said, leaning against the cold mahogany desk. "I just told people the truth. It turns out, when you spend decades stepping on people, they're quite eager to help you trip." The door opened, and the bailiff escorted in a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. It was Sarah, my father's head paralegal for 15 years. She had been the backbone of his firm, the one who knew where every body was buried, because she was the one who had been forced to dig the graves. My father's face went from purple to a ghostly, sickly white. Sarah had been his most loyal soldier, or so he thought. He didn't realize that Sarah's daughter had been a regular at my diner. We had talked over late-night pancakes about how Sarah was being bullied into signing off on irregular documents under the threat of losing her pension. I had spent months helping Sarah realize that the only way to protect her future was to destroy the man threatening it. "Sarah," my father gasped, trying to summon his old authority, "don't be foolish. Whatever she's told you, I can fix it. I can." "You can't fix anything anymore, Julian," Sarah interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. She handed a thick stack of notarized affidavits to the judge. "These are the original signatures, the ones he told me to shred. I kept them in a safety deposit box because I knew this day would come. I just didn't think it would be Lily who brought it." The judge spent the next hour meticulously comparing my digital data with Sarah's physical evidence. The waitress and the subordinate had reconstructed the crime scene of the century, while the criminal was busy laughing at them. The bailiffs moved in. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place was the most beautiful melody I had ever heard. It wasn't the sound of metal, it was the sound of a debt being paid in full. As they led my father out of the chambers toward the waiting police cruisers, the hallway was packed with reporters. The news of the Rose Empire collapsing had spread like wildfire. He tried to hide his face, but I stood right in his path. He stopped, his eyes burning into mine. "You think you've won? You've destroyed the family name. You have nothing now." "I have exactly what I started with," I replied, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "My dignity, my education, and a hell of a lot of experience in knowing how to handle garbage." I watched him go, but I didn't feel the rush of joy I expected. I felt a strange, quiet clarity. The man who called me just a waitress was now just a prisoner. However, as the dust settled, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted and the engine was idling. A man in a dark suit was watching me, a phone pressed to his ear. My father was the face of the operation, but he wasn't the only one involved. There were people much higher up the food chain who couldn't afford for me to keep talking. I realized then that winning the court case was just the opening act. If I wanted to survive the night, I had to use the one thing my father never possessed: the trust of the people he ignored. The black SUV didn't move. It sat there like a predator in the tall grass, watching me stand on the courthouse steps. For a second, I felt that old, familiar chill, the one that used to make me small when my father raised his voice. But then I felt the weight of my laptop bag on my shoulder. That bag didn't just contain data. It contained my freedom. Instead, I walked 3 blocks over to a crowded bus station, weaving through the afternoon commuters. I knew how to disappear. It's what I'd been doing for 3 years. I hopped on a bus, rode it for 2 stops, and then slipped out the back door into a narrow alleyway that led to the kitchen entrance of a high-end bistro. The chef, a man named Marco who used to work the line with me at the diner, didn't ask questions. He just handed me an apron and pointed toward the locker room. 10 minutes later, Lily Rose was gone. In her place was just a waitress in a black uniform, carrying a tray of appetizers into a dining room filled with the city's elite. As I moved between the tables, I saw them. 3 men sitting in a corner booth, the kind of men who don't have names on building fronts because they own the people who do. One of them was the district attorney, the same man who was supposed to be prosecuting my father. "He's a liability now," the man in the center whispered, leaning over a plate of seared scallops. "Julian was supposed to keep the rose petal accounts quiet. If that girl has the raw server logs, she doesn't just have him, she has us." "She's a waitress," the DA replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "How much could she possibly understand? She probably just found the surface-level skimming." "The surface-level skimming doesn't lead to the judge's chambers in 20 minutes, Arthur," the third man snapped. "She's smarter than he gave her credit for. We need to find where she's keeping the backups before the feds get involved." I stood less than 3 feet away, refilling the water glasses at the table next to them. My hand didn't shake, my breath remained steady. They were looking for a high-tech whistleblower, a corporate spy, or a vengeful socialite. They weren't looking at the girl who was clearing their empty bread baskets. I realized then that my father wasn't the final boss. He was just the gatekeeper. The money he had stolen from the hospital wasn't just for his penthouse. It was a contribution to a much larger machine that kept these men in power. I slipped back into the kitchen and grabbed my phone. I had 1 card left to play, and it was the most dangerous one. I had been sending the data to a secure cloud, but I hadn't hit publish yet. I needed a witness, someone they couldn't bribe, threaten, or bury. I called the one person who hated the DA more than I hated my father, a disgraced investigative journalist named Elias Vance, who now spent his days drinking bitter coffee at the very diner where I worked. "Elias," I whispered, ducking into the walk-in freezer. "It's Lily. I have the ledgers, not just my father's, the real ones, the ones with the DA's signature on the donations." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the scratching of a lighter. "Lily, if you're lying, they'll kill my career again. If you're telling the truth, they'll do a lot worse to you." "I'm at the Gilded Bistro," I said. "Check the service entrance in 5 minutes. I'm leaving a white napkin in the trash bin. Inside is the key to a locker at the bus station." I hung up and stepped out of the freezer, but as I turned the corner toward the dining room, I ran straight into a wall of black fabric. It was the driver of the SUV. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. He was wearing a kitchen staff shirt, but his eyes were stone cold, and his hands were way too clean for a cook. "The tray, Lily," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Hand it over, and maybe you get to walk out of here through the front door." The air in the kitchen felt thick, heavy with the smell of searing meat, and the sudden sharp scent of adrenaline. The man stood between me and the exit, his posture relaxed, but his eyes tracking my every move. He thought that because I was smaller, I was helpless. "The tray?" I asked, my voice steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "You're in the kitchen, mister. Whoever you are, everyone is carrying a tray." "Don't play games," he growled, stepping closer. "We know you didn't just give the judge a flash drive. We know you have the rest of the files. Give me the password to the cloud backup and you can go back to your quiet life at the diner." I looked around. To the rest of the staff, we just looked like 2 employees having a tense conversation. I saw Marco, the head chef, watching us from the corner of his eye. I caught his gaze and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of my head. My quiet life died the day my father called me just a waitress in front of a court reporter, I said, stepping back toward the industrial stove. And if you think I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom after everything I've done to get here, you really didn't read my resume. He lunged. In a movie, there would be a choreographed fight. In reality, it was a blur of motion. I didn't try to punch him. I did what I'd done 1,000 times when a drunk customer got handsy at 3 a.m. I used the environment. I grabbed a gallon-sized tin of industrial frying oil sitting on the prep counter and tipped it. The floor became a skating rink in a second. He slipped, his heavy boots losing traction, and as he stumbled, I grabbed a nearby stainless steel lid and slammed it against the side of his head. The clang echoed through the kitchen. He went down hard, groaning. "Marco, back door," I yelled. Marco didn't hesitate. He shoved a heavy cart of dirty dishes in front of the swinging doors to the dining room, blocking the DA's other associates from entering. "Go, Lily." I didn't see anything. I sprinted out the service entrance and into the rain. I didn't head for the bus station. That was a decoy. I had told Elias to check the trash bin at the station, but the real key was already taped to the bottom of a specific table at our old diner. I ran through the winding back streets, my lungs burning. I needed to get to a public place, somewhere with cameras and witnesses, somewhere they couldn't just make me disappear. As I rounded the corner toward the diner, I saw Elias sitting in his usual booth, looking out the window. But he wasn't alone. 2 men in suits were standing over him, and the diner's neon sign was flickering, half dark. They had anticipated my move. They were closing the net. I ducked behind a parked car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had the truth in my pocket, but I was running out of places to tell it. Then I remembered something my father used to say when he was teaching me how to play chess, before he decided I wasn't worth the effort. If you can't protect the queen, turn the pawns into a wall. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the FBI. I opened the LilyCalmStories community page and the local Waitresses of the City forum. To anyone working a shift tonight, I typed, my fingers flying. I'm at the Silver Kettle. I have the evidence that Julian Rose and the DA used to steal the hospital funds. They're trying to take it. I need witnesses. Bring your cameras. Bring your voices. I hit post. Within seconds, the blue scene numbers started climbing. 5, 50, 500. I stood up, smoothed my hair, and walked toward the front door of the diner. I wasn't running anymore. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the Silver Kettle. The familiar chime of the entrance bell felt like a battle cry. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the cold tension of a standoff. The 2 men standing over Elias turned to look at me. They were polished, expensive, and completely out of place against the cracked vinyl booths. Elias looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and respect. He saw the fire in my eyes. The kind of fire you only get when you've spent years being told you don't matter. "Miss Rose," one of the suits said, his voice smooth as silk and just as artificial. "You've caused a lot of trouble for some very important people. Why don't we step outside and discuss how to make this go away? We have a very generous settlement offer for your silence." "I've spent my whole life being silent," I said, walking behind the counter and grabbing a carafe of coffee. It was a reflex, a comfort. I'm bored of it. And as for your settlement, I think I'll pass. I prefer the tips I earn." "You're being naive," the other man spat, stepping toward the counter. "Look around. It's just us. No judge, no cameras, no Sarah to save you. Give us the drive, or we'll take it." I checked my watch. You're right. It is just us. For about another 30 seconds. Suddenly, the roar of engines drowned out the hum of the refrigerator. Headlights flooded the diner, cutting through the rain-streaked windows like spotlights. 1 car, then 5, then 20. The doors swung open and they poured in. They weren't soldiers or lawyers. They were the people who keep the city running while the elite sleep. Waitresses in their uniforms from the bistro down the street. Delivery drivers still wearing their rain slickers. Line cooks, janitors, and busboys. Each one of them held a smartphone, the recording lights glowing red in the dim diner light. "What is this?" the suit asked, his face pale as he looked at the wall of people surrounding them. "This is the Just a Waitress Club," I said, leaning over the counter. "Every one of these people has been ignored by men like you. They've heard your secrets while they were mopping your floors. They've seen your deals while they were serving your steaks. And right now, every single one of them is live streaming this conversation to thousands of people. Elias stood up, pulling a digital recorder from his pocket with a grin. And I'm the one who's going to write the front page story that explains exactly why the district attorney is trying to strong-arm a girl in a diner at midnight. The men looked at the sea of glowing screens. They knew the rules of the game had changed. In a courtroom, they could lie. In an alleyway, they could use force. But in the court of public opinion, under the gaze of 1,000 lenses, they were powerless. The files are already in the hands of the Federal Bureau, I lied. Well, it was only a lie for another 10 minutes, as Sarah was currently meeting her contact. By tomorrow morning, your important people are going to be very busy looking for their own lawyers. The suits didn't say another word. They pushed through the crowd, shielding their faces from the cameras, and vanished into the night. The diner erupted in cheers. People I had never met were hugging me, shaking my hand. They weren't just happy for me, they were happy for themselves. For one night, the invisible people had become the only ones who saw everything. I sat down in the booth across from Elias, my legs finally shaking. "You did it, Lily," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You actually took them all down." "No," I said, looking at my reflection in the window. "We did, but it's not over yet. There's still one person I need to see before I can finally take this apron off." The prison visiting room was cold, smelling of industrial bleach and desperation. I sat on one side of the scratched plexiglass, waiting. When the door finally opened, Julian Rose walked in. He wasn't wearing a silk tie or a tailored suit anymore. He was in a rough orange jumpsuit that washed out his skin, making him look every bit of his 60 years. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't look at me with rage this time. He looked at me with a hollow, haunting confusion. "I heard about the DA," he said, his voice crackling through the receiver. "I heard about the others. You didn't just burn me, Lily. You burned the whole forest." "The forest was rotten, Julian," I replied. "I just provided the spark." He leaned in, his eyes searching mine. "Why? You could have had everything. I would have eventually brought you back. You would have been the heir to a legacy. Now, you're still just you." I smiled, and for the first time in my life, there was no weight behind it. No fear, no resentment, just peace. "That's where you're wrong. I'm not just anything. I am the woman who built her own life while you were busy trying to ruin it. You thought a uniform was a cage. You didn't realize it was a disguise. I learned more about justice from behind a diner counter than I ever would have from behind your mahogany desk." I stood up, placing the receiver back on the hook. "I didn't come here to gloat," I whispered, though he couldn't hear me through the glass. "I came to tell you that I've sold the family house. The money is going back to the hospital endowment fund. Every last cent." I walked out of that prison and into the bright midday sun. My car was packed. I wasn't going back to the silver kettle, and I wasn't going back to my father's world. I had a degree to finish, and a new life to start in a city where nobody knew the name Rose. As I drove past the city limits, I saw a small roadside cafe. I pulled over, walked inside, and sat at the counter. A young girl, looking tired but determined, walked up to me with a notepad. "What can I get for you?" she asked. I looked at her name tag, then at her tired eyes, and I gave her the biggest tip I'd ever given in my life. "Just a coffee," I said. "And remember, never let them tell you that you're just the girl serving it." I hope you guys enjoyed this journey. Where in the world are you watching this from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Do you think Lily was right to give away her entire inheritance, or should she have kept it for herself?